Related to the other conversation, but not easily tied into it, and thus being addressed as a separate topic here, is the question of epistemology, both pre-modern and modern. Essentially, there's a narrative that pre-modern epistemology was, to put it in the colloquial, all fucked up, right? Because people could believe things that were told to them by authority figures, accept things on faith and without evidence, and generally get a pass for so doing. And that the world became a much better place when, in the early modern period, we developed a scientific epistemology where, in order to verify claims, you needed to either derive them from deduction, logically correct deduction from self-evident first principles that couldn't be disproven, or else in a less epistemologically resolute but purely empirical sense, through testing of hypotheses in rigorous conditions where you could replicate an experiment and find that a certain thing was the consistent finding of series of experiments. It wouldn't necessarily give you the same degree of epistemological certainty as deductive argumentation from self-evident first principles, but at least it would give you a kind of experimental know-how truth that would suffice for the production of scientific hypotheses and the application of those hypotheses to developing various technologies in the world. That basically the idea is that that's just a better way than the pre-modern approach to epistemology. I'm also not sure that that's the case. One of the more obvious routes for this is what's happened in philosophical epistemology from the time of Descartes to the modern day. Basically, how the world arrived at postmodern skepticism, at the idea that, wow, you can't prove anything, is from the nature of the epistemology itself. If you needed to deduce everything from self-evident first principles and nothing else would really count. You couldn't take anything at face value. You needed to make it work through an indubitable sequence of reasoning. What you found very, very quickly, and it didn't take Western culture very long to discover this, is that essentially in the end you can't prove anything, right? Descartes ended up immediately after his cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, which he thought to be indubitable, needing to posit the existence of God to account for the transition from the workings of his own mind, which he found to be indubitable, to any kind of correct knowledge about the external world. And subsequent philosophy has simply called the bluff on devices like that to say that that's not really providing the kind of epistemological rigor that was promised in the method, that essentially you were still smuggling in non-self-evident ideas and things that had not yet been proven in order to make any kind of proof work. As a mild sidebar, I'm quoting a teacher of mine here from long ago, it is interesting to see the extent to which classical Indian philosophy recognized this literally millennia before anybody in Western philosophy. Dates for Nagarjuna, the Madhyamika philosopher within Buddhism, vary to a large degree, but even the most conservative estimates about his date, meaning the ones that would make him later rather than earlier, would say, at least 2 millennia, we already in Indian philosophy had the radical kind of epistemological skepticism that you would expect to result from the idea that you needed to ground everything into correct inferences from self-evident truths. They had already discovered BCE that was not ever going to work, that was never going to produce knowledge. And Madhyamika is basically an unfolding of that skepticism. The other main route to proof, right, the empirical scientific method, doesn't promise epistemological knowledge. It promises a kind of practical know-how, but is often found by many people to be superior because of kind of the tricks that it allows you to do in the world, that it produces technology. And that's all right so far as what it is, correct? But kind of retreating to William James here, it's not clear that method is really doing everything it could epistemologically either, and isn't in some sense and in some contexts within human life a disservice to human knowledge. Again, going to William James, there's basically two ways in the world to fail to arrive at truth. One is that you fail to arrive at truth because you were deceived. There, you can probably see that the scientific method and not taking anything on hearsay and all of that basic epistemological shift in early modernity in the West is really good for that. It's very good for keeping you from being deceived about things about which you otherwise may have been. It basically says, test everything, prove everything, don't ever let yourself be convinced. That is one way to fail to arrive at truth, right? You can fail to arrive at truth through being deceived. But it's also possible to fail to arrive at truths you would have otherwise come to by requiring a form of epistemological proof, that a high enough burden of epistemological proof to believe something that you fail to perceive as true things which in fact are. You can see how this would happen, right? Like, let's go back to Descartes and the cogito. Say you were a very strict Cartesian and you discovered you could prove nothing beyond the existence of your own mind, that nothing else was going to meet that standard. And it was in fact true that there was a whole world around you, populated by people, by other minds, with relationships between objects that you could know a great deal about. Even Descartes thought this in the end, right? That would mean, if you stuck to what you could know just by that epistemological high bar, that there would be many, 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 many things about the world you potentially could know that you failed to know because your burden of epistemological proof was so high that it could never be met. And I would venture, again with James, that much of our skepticism about religious experiences and about religious knowledge is of that second kind, that there are things that we very well could know, that are real phenomena about the world, that we subject to such a degree of corrosive epistemological testing that we are unable to perceive their truth when in fact it is likely that they are true. James argued this by documenting religious experiences that individuals have. If you go around polling people ethnographically, and they're not ashamed to tell you because of their education predisposing them to reject a metaphysical worldview, and just ask people, what have you experienced that you might interpret as a religious phenomena? Almost everybody has something. I'm finding this in my own life. Nearly everybody believes in ghosts or has experienced something that they claim to be a ghost. Lots of people believe in divination. Lots of people have claimed to have experienced a god or the presence of a god through prayer. It's just phenomenologically true that people have something that can be interpreted as religious experiences at a relatively high degree of social frequency. How we want to interpret that, whether we want to call that religious or not, that's ultimately up to us, but there is something in the world that people call religious experiences. Just plain a fact, right? One way of looking at that, and this is like the early modernist, high epistemological burden proof, is to say you need to do something more than just have that experience in order to prove that that's an epistemologically reliable experience. Whereas a pre-modern epistemology may not have demanded that, and that may have been the more reasonable epistemology. Who is to say that we are not being misled by failing to accept religious truths that could be known with a less burdensome epistemology? Who is to say that the epistemological turn in early modernity that led to the scientific method is the best for all areas of human knowledge? I would say that would be an act of epistemological arrogance of the first order.